Hello, comrades and fellow dissidents. Welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. I'm Jacob Shapiro. As usual, I'm your host. I'm the Director of Geopolitical Analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me is Tack. Sim is the Chief Military Analyst at Force Analysis. You can find him on Twitter if you want to see more of his insights at Tack. For a long time, people have been telling me not to record podcasts or do content on holidays. I've always rejected that because I always find that I want to listen to podcasts on holidays, and I always get upset when it seems like there's just a black hole of content when people go into holidays. Also, we were looking at the data for this podcast, and about half of you are actually not in the United States. So we have a broad listener base. So we're bringing this to you on July 4th. Please share widely so that I can prove my marketing gurus wrong, that it actually is a good idea to post content on holidays like this. Sim and I recorded on June 30th. We're posting this on July 4th. Happy U.S. Independence Day to those of you celebrating. Otherwise, you can write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you have any questions about the podcast, want to suggest a guest, want to talk about what Cognitive Investments does or anything like that. Also, please remember to rate and review the podcast and share it with anyone that you think that might like it. Specifically for listeners who are getting to this podcast from the Perch Pod. I've been saying this and I'm going to keep saying it. We're posting these episodes on the Perch Pod for the rest of the summer, but at the end of August, we're going to only be posting the full episodes on the Cognitive Dissidence podcast. So you need to make your way over to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast. We'll make sure that there's a link in the description here. All you have to do is click the button and subscribe to Cognitive Dissidence. You'll get these bi-weekly conversations that you're used to, my weekly chat with Rob Larity, our Chief Investment Officer at CI, about geopolitics and markets, and then some new really exciting deep dive and narrative long-form content that I'm really excited to share with you beginning in August. So enough ado from me. I hope you're all doing well out there. Cheers. Thank you so much for making this podcast a success, and we're going to keep doing it. We'll see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Sim, thanks for coming back. I wanted to have you on, first of all, because until last week, you held the record for most downloads of an episode in the first 24 hours of a release, and Jacek Bartoszek just beat you in his last episode, so I wanted to give you a chance to reclaim the throne here on the podcast. But second of all, we haven't done a good update on the Russia-Ukraine war, really, since you came on March 8th. So listeners, if you haven't checked out that episode from Sim on March 8th, please go take a listen. But I thought I just might start with a pretty simple question, Sim, which is, what's changed since March 8th? What do you think the current state of play on the battlefield is, as succinctly as you can describe it to us?
Well, first off, let me thank you for having me back on here. It's really great to be back. Much appreciated. In terms of what happened in Ukraine since March, we've seen some pretty massive changes in the battlefield. For starters, back in March, Russia was still trying to conduct its offensive against the capital Kiev, Chernihiv, another northern town, and the city of Kharkiv. Now, since then, about a month after we had our discussion early in April, Russia officially ended its offensive efforts near Kiev and Chernihiv, which, of course, it was forced to do. This wasn't a voluntary decision. Russia was taking massive losses in these battles. Ukraine was actually starting to walk back the Russian military in those different offensives. So it became very much an untenable effort for Russia. And Russia decided it might be better to focus the capacity that it had, or that it still had at that point, because it did take massive losses in that entire effort, to focus that on southern Ukraine, where it had initially had better results, etc. So that was one big change. Russia ended those offensives on their own accord, shifted those forces south. But then we also saw the battle around the city of Kharkiv, which, of course, in Ukraine now referred to as the hero city. Kharkiv withstood massive offensives by some of Russia's best equipped and trained forces. And eventually, Russia didn't decide to give up the offensive there, but Ukrainian forces eventually forced Russian troops back to the Russian border, where they are currently still fighting. Of course, that Russian resistance is heavier close to the border. This is also where Russian artillery from familiar positions across the border within Russia can support their defensive. So, things become a little more difficult the closer you get to Russia. Mm-hmm. But that's been another big change. And then, of course, the third big element here is what happened in the south as Russia relocated those forces from the north, renewed its offensive efforts in the south, or Donbass, the southeast of Ukraine, essentially. And there, over the past month or so, we have seen Russia achieve some decent success. Costly success still. We're still seeing Russia face high levels of attrition. We are also seeing Ukraine face that attrition, by the way. This is not as much a one-sided thing as it was in the beginning of the conflict. But we have seen Russia recently take the city of Severodonetsk, as well as a number of villages south of the city, enveloping the town of Lysychansk, which is just next to Severodonetsk across the river. So there's a pocket that appears like it is about to fall to Russia as well. And this is going to reshape those front lines in Donbass. Ukraine is going to have to reposition and try to establish a new defensive line. Doing so, of course, could potentially open additional gaps to the Russians. But that is kind of the big effort, the big battle that is taking place right now.
I guess that raises the question of, what do you think Russia's military objectives are right now? So it seemed like their initial objective was get to Kyiv, decapitate the government, install whoever they wanted. They were thinking very arrogantly about their own capabilities. They got punched in the mouth, and then they've countered. I mean, they've not given up, as you pointed out. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about how bad Russia's fighting forces were. The ability to take a hit and then reposition, that's actually also a pretty substantial indicator that we're still dealing here with a pretty motivated force. But do you think that it's realistic that Russia takes the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk and calls it a break and says, all right, we've taken what we want now, we're going to annex these parts, there's going to be a temporary period, maybe it's years long, we'll get some kind of ceasefire in place while they lick their wounds, and then they'll go forward going on? Or to your point, are they trying to punch a hole open to where they can get back to a more maximalist war aim? Where do you sit based on how they've deployed about what their objectives are?
Look, based on the decisions that we saw Russia make in February of this year, I don't think I have a decent gauge of the level of hubris that might exist in Moscow. So I can't really tell you how far they think they can push this. But in realistic military terms, I think it seems very likely that Russia is looking indeed at completing those territories of Donetsk and Luhansk, based on the statements that were made early on in the conflict. For anyone that remembers, right before Russia invaded Ukraine, they recognized the DPR and LPR, the Donetsk and Luhansk separatist republics. And in that recognition, they also recognized them as the legitimate rulers over the entire Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts within Ukraine. Of course, at the time, these republics did not actually occupy the entire republics. And that, I think, is part of what we'll see Russia try to achieve here. At this point, they have pretty much taken all of the Luhansk Oblast. Very small patches remain there, really, but there is still that gap in the Donetsk Republic, especially around the cities of Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, which are now kind of coming under pressure after Severodonetsk has fallen. So this is a place where Russia has tried to fight toward those cities for a while. Since I think about end of April or early May, Russia's been conducting offensives across the Donetsk River near this town called Izium. And from this town, they've established a bridgehead south of the river. For a long time, their only bridgehead in that area. That progress has stalled, and it kind of, they had their separate efforts come and go, but they were clearly trying to advance toward those towns of Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. And I think that's what we'll see happen now from the east, where as they capture Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, a next line of battle will develop, but that will direct their forces towards those remaining cities. And once they hold those cities, there's only a few tiny villages between the control they will have and a claim to the entire Oblast of Donetsk. And of course, in addition to the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, Russia has already captured a lot of terrain south of the Dnieper River, north of Crimea. That little portion of land that ensures them, a land connection between Crimea and the Donbas republics, which, I mean, I'm not sure how necessary that in itself is in order to sustain either of those, but it also guarantees Russia control over the North Crimean Canal, which, of course, supplies fresh water to the Crimean Peninsula, makes it a little more survivable than it has been recently.
I'm glad you brought up that axis, because that was the other question I wanted to ask, which is, I mean, what's going on in the Donbass is it's depressing and it's tragic and it's particularly bad for Ukraine, but there's limited global impact. There's a lot more global impact with what Russia's plans are in the south, specifically around, are they going to go after Mykolaiv? Do they have ambitions after Odessa? They've shelled both of those cities in sort of recent weeks. Mykolaiv really does seem to be right within their crosshairs. They've even shelled the port there and some of the grain infrastructure. And the reason I say that this is more important globally is because I don't know how long this war is going to go on. Maybe we can talk about that in a little bit. But if they start destroying port infrastructure in that part of Ukraine, then you can't get grains out, no matter if there is a humanitarian ceasefire or a corridor or whatever else is opened up. And the Russians have not been clear to me in their actions about whether they're actually considering pushing forward on that access. So can you talk a little bit about what you see developing in that part of in Ukraine?
Yeah, this is actually a very good point, because this is kind of an element of the battlefield that I forgot to mention when I discussed what had changed since March. But actually, another big element that has changed is the fact that Russia has actually kind of had to give up its efforts to take the city of Odessa. At the time that we last talked, I don't remember exactly what the positions on the battlefield were at the specific date, but around that time, Russia was still trying to capture Mykolaiv, get across those rivers to make their way to Odessa. But once Russia withdrew from Kiev and Chernihiv, they also pretty much gave up their efforts to keep pushing there. And since then, Russia's been fighting a defensive war around the city of Kherson. And Ukraine has scored the occasional successes in that battle. Just earlier this morning, I was reading some reports of some villages north of Kherson being recaptured by Ukraine. So little by little, Ukraine seems to be trying and seems to be able, to some degree, to try and push Russia back to the Dnieper River as kind of a border there. But I think we can definitely say that the opportunity for Russia to rapidly advance beyond the Dnieper and get to Odessa and occupy that entire coastline, that moment has passed long ago. In addition to cutting off their access by ground The Ukrainians have also very clearly been starting to demonstrate their ability to strike at Russia in the Black Sea. We've recently seen, a lot of strikes against the Russian positions on Snake Island. We've seen strikes against gas platforms in the Black Sea, against Russian vessels. That Ukraine is clearly demonstrating, this is a no-go zone now, right? And of course, when we're talking about the potential to take Odessa, that is where people were also talking about the potential for amphibious operations in support of that. So that is clearly being ruled out. And if you can't get there by sea, you can't get there by land. There's really not that much you can do to really try and threaten Odessa, beyond conducting your sporadic strikes to simply erode the infrastructure. But on that note, by the way, since you mentioned the grain exports, so the grain exports through maritime traffic have been massively disrupted. I mean, pretty much brought to a standstill, essentially. But it was interesting. Last week, I heard from someone that apparently grain silos are being constructed in Poland near the Ukrainian border as a way to actually facilitate ground transport of grain, to actually have those silos have capacity to store a lot of that Ukrainian grain there, and kind of start to organize a more efficient distribution or logistics from that point on. So I'm hoping that even though that maritime route continues to be blocked, that at the very least, some of that grain will actually end up on world markets again by opening up that land route.
Yeah, I mean, just as a brief aside on that, I mean, I was at a conference in Geneva, was that a month ago now? It might have been a month ago now. Time flies. And I think I can't remember if I've said this on the podcast or not, but I'll just tell the story really briefly here, which is it was one of the last sessions of one of the first days of the conference. It was like 4 or 5 p.m. And I don't know why they put it there, because nobody goes to that last session. Everybody's already at the happy hour having a drink. And it was two actual Ukrainian farmers. So it was a conference of a lot of grain traders. They're trying to short markets and buy this grain, sell this grain. But they had 2 Ukrainian farmers there. And I'm not kidding. It was a very large conference, hundreds of people. I think I was one of 7 or 8 people in the room listening to the Ukrainian farmers. And they gave a very stark warning. And they talked about this issue. They said, yes, it's nice that you want us to transport things over road and over rail to places like Poland and things like that. But we don't have the trucks. We have different rail gauges. It's going to take time to build these silos. Maybe in 2 or 3 years, if you really focus on it and you give us a lot of money, maybe we can build the infrastructure that's necessary to do that. But here, today, in the next year, our infrastructure can't handle it. Everything that Ukraine has invested in to become a grain exporter in the last decade and beyond is organized at the ports. And the other thing they basically said was, look, it's great if you want to help us get stuff out through land, but we had a great year last year. We've been able to put a lot of money away in our coffers and things like that. So we're okay for this year. But if we can't get the Black Sea opened by the end of the year, we're going to start planting buckwheat just to feed ourselves. Forget about a 50% reduction next year. You're talking about 0% because we just don't have the infrastructure to do things. And most of the traders were not there because they were already at happy hour. But that has stuck with me. So I think you're right that the future of Ukrainian grain exports is probably going to depend on that infrastructure. But it's very hard to snap your fingers and make that happen. If we're going to avert some of the global food crisis fears that are coming, we're going to have to get the Black Sea open somehow. And there are a lot of scenarios in which the Black Sea can open. The war doesn't have to end for a humanitarian corridor to open. But we can get to that in a second. Before we leave the battlefield itself and get into some of those other sort of bigger picture things. A very simple question: who's winning right now, in your opinion? And sort of a sub part of that question: how much is Ukraine really dependent on continued weapons shipments from the United States and other countries? If that went away, for instance, would Ukraine basically fold in that moment? I've seen that narrative out there, but I wanted to get a gut check, a reality check from you on that specific point. But who's winning right now, do you think?
Look, I think it's difficult to say who exactly is winning at this very point. I think both sides are suffering heavily from the fighting that is going on. We're no longer in those first few months of the conflict where Russia was very awkwardly and very carelessly exposing its forces and taking massive hits, taking massive casualties. I think we've gotten to a point where casualties and equipment losses between Russia and Ukraine might have come to a more similar level. Of course, the weapons deliveries from the West are a big support for Ukraine in that regard, because it does start to provide them with a slight level of overmatch, right? So if they are able to use these more modern pieces of equipment, the more accurate artillery, having the longer range HIMARS system, not the longest range HIMARS weapons, of course. There was some debate about that on the US side. But these weapons are already allowing them to reach a little farther behind Russian lines and disrupt command and control and logistics. And all of that is very useful. In addition to that, there's also the fact that we know Russia is facing a lot of difficulties supplying its forces. And I don't mean that in the same way that we did in the beginning of the conflict when, Russian convoys were running out of fuel. I'm talking about the overall ability to continue to put enough ammunition into the battlefield, to have enough ammunition for forces to continue to fight. And that is something where, we've seen, for example, Russia starting to empty out ammunition storages in Belarus recently to actually start to supply the forces that are fighting in Ukraine. So that's kind of a big tell, right? Yeah. And when it comes to more advanced weapons, we've seen Russia having to use, almost ancient anti-ship missiles to conduct strikes in Ukraine because they don't have enough of the more modern, accurate weapons. And I don't know if you remember the Kremenchuk incident just last week, actually, where a shopping mall was hit by Russia. That's a perfect example of this. So two Russian Kh-22 missiles, which are actually anti-ship missiles, old ones at that. And they were used against the ground target, which is not what they are intended for, of course. So not using their radar homing to home in on a vessel, the accuracy becomes quite a bit less than what it's supposed to be. So trying to hit this big factory in Kremenchuk, they ended up actually spiking a shopping mall with all the results that came with it. And this is absolutely careless, of course. I mean, a war crime if there ever was one, I think. But the reality is Russia is facing these difficulties when it comes to supplying its forces. And I think that's where the Western support for Ukraine is a massive level of support that can really push them through. Because one of the things that NATO countries have been very intelligently doing is providing artillery systems to Ukraine, which are not only, better, more accurate artillery systems, but they are also artillery systems that are firing NATO standard rounds. Before this, Ukraine was firing Soviet rounds from their Soviet era artillery. Of course, NATO cannot supply that artillery ammunition. So now that Ukraine is shifting little by little to using these NATO standard ammunitions, NATO is actually able to keep that going. So my suspicion is that if a conflict would continue at this level of intensity over months and months, this can only play out to the advantage of Ukraine, because they should normally continue to get those resources, that support that will enable them to keep fighting, while Russia will probably have to be more and more focused on rationing and limiting their actual consumption of many goods, not just ammunition, but probably food, water, fuel, all those things will probably have some limits to it as well.
Interesting. I mean, you mentioned Russian hubris, so I know we can't predict necessarily their next move here, because a lot of what they've done, I think, is irrational and counterproductive. But it sounds like what you're saying is that Russia does have an interest in consolidating its positions and calling for some kind of pause, because it sounds like they're not going to fare well if this thing goes on much longer. Is that the right conclusion to draw from what you just said?
I think from the Russian side, that's exactly the goal. That's where they're trying to get at, and I think that is the great risk. Inserting my own opinion here, of course, the great risk for Ukraine is that if other countries that are currently supporting them, or even if the Ukrainian electorate, for example, becomes convinced that this would be the better outcome, there's a lot to be said for this. If you can stabilize that conflict, it means an incredible gain in terms of saving human life and ending suffering along the front lines. And, we shouldn't ignore that. Once a conflict gets going, it's not all about winning or losing. There is a massive cost of conflict simply continuing. That being said, I think if we're looking at a higher geopolitical level where we are looking at Russia's increasingly belligerent behavior in Central Europe over the past 10 years, if we want to put a stop to that at any point, I think this is the opportunity. This is where Russia has exposed itself. But if the West starts to believe that it might be better to put this conflict to sleep and end the suffering instead of continuing to supply Ukraine to keep the fight going and not to allow Russia that pause, that rest, then I think we're going to be in a really dangerous position in terms of how Russia will redevelop its capabilities and continue that belligerence towards the West.
Yeah, I'll make your point even sharper. For Ukraine might reach the point where it wants that kind of resolution. I haven't seen that yet out of Zelensky, but maybe at some point he will make that very difficult decision to swallow national pride and have some kind of ceasefire in order to end the conflict. But if the West, and in particular the Europeans, decide that that's what they want to push Zelensky to do, it's not going to. They'll say it's for the human element. It's because they want cheap energy and because they want cheap food again. That's really why it'll. If that's what happens, I think that's what'll be behind it.
No, fair point.
Let's zoom out a little bit. So that's what's going on the battlefield itself. My first sort of zoomed out question here is tied to what you just said, which is, how capacity constrained is Russia now, just in general from a military perspective? So we had Yatsik on just last week to talk about Kaliningrad and some of the fears there. I'm unclear about whether Russia even has the forces available to contemplate defending Kaliningrad or going up the Suwalki Gap and things like that. Certainly, if we're looking at the South Caucasus or at Central Asia or the Balkans or some of these other areas where Russia has strategic interests, do they even have now the military force to do anything if, say, another Kazakhstan protest situation arose, or if there was a real war in the South Caucasus or over Nagorno-Karabakh and they wanted to support the Armenians? Is their support of Assad in Syria or factions in Libya at risk because they have focused so much of their military on the Ukraine conflict? Or is there spare capacity? Is their military bigger than we're giving it credit for?
Yeah, I think we need to be careful in making big conclusions on, Russia's capacity being hurt by the conflict in Ukraine and automatically translating that into they cannot do this or they cannot do that. The reality is a little more nuanced where, we probably need to talk about how effective would they be in doing X or doing Y rather than being able to do it or not. There's a lot of variation in how many resources you need to do something versus to do it effectively, right? But coming to some of the theaters that you mentioned, you brought up Kaliningrad, and Kaliningrad is a very interesting location because obviously Russia finds it tremendously important. There is a division-sized force that Russia has stationed in Kaliningrad, in addition to, of course, the naval and aerial elements. But there is about a division-sized ground force there. And interestingly, this is about the only force in Russia, especially outside of the east, outside of the western and southern military districts, the ones that face NATO, This is the only location where they actually haven't pooled forces to go and fight in Ukraine. And I think that tells you how important they think it is to defend Kaliningrad, and how difficult that defense might be. And in reality, if a larger conflict were to arise, regardless of who starts it, Kaliningrad is going to be immediately challenged. The only way for Russia to maintain control over Kaliningrad is to very rapidly establish an axis or a line of communication to Kaliningrad over land. So that essentially means, closing the Suwalki Gap from Belarus, as you mentioned, or coming in through Lithuania from the Baltic states and establishing a connection that way, all of which would be tremendously difficult operations, especially given the amount of NATO forces that have already been built up. We're not just talking about the Baltic states and their militaries and Poland. We're talking about a lot of U.S. forces and forces from other NATO partners that have been forward deployed in these very areas exactly because of this risk, right? So parking that for a second, if we look at, how much has the Russian military actually suffered in the Ukraine conflict, I don't have the most up-to-date numbers in front of me right now, but on the whole, Russia has lost about 25% of its tank force, for example. What that means is that, it doesn't mean that you don't have a tank force left. 75% is still pretty good. That's a high number, right? But it means that in addition to those 25% that it's lost, there is also an additional maybe 25%, I'm just guessing here, I don't have the exact numbers, that is actually deployed in Ukraine. Then you have another portion of your armor that you will want to keep in reserve to potentially at some point perhaps deploy into Ukraine, depending on what happens there. And then you still have all of your other responsibilities across all of your borders. And that's when we're talking about, Kaliningrad, potential conflicts with NATO, potential interventions in Central Asia. So the reality is that, losing 25% of your capacity, that really starts to constrain your ability to do anything. So I think when we're talking about high intensity conflict with NATO, as the Kaliningrad Baltic scenario would involve, or, even starting a conflict with Finland and Sweden over there, them joining NATO, something like that, I think, we don't even need to start talking about this. That's simply not going to happen. Like, Russia cannot do this. If they try, they would be so stretched that we would simply cakewalk to Moscow, right?
I say this in jest and understanding that it's a little bit dark humor, but I invite the Russians to try the Finns. I'm sure they have a gift waiting for them if they want to try and attack Finland.
For sure. And some Finnish friends of mine have expressed very, very similar feelings. A lot of people have been talking about whether now would be a good time to also reappropriate Karelia. There's a lot of things going on there. Now, I doubt that NATO would carelessly be looking to start a conflict. If they were that. If they would be willing to take that level of risk, there's probably a few more things they could start to do in Ukraine before starting to mess with that. But the reality is, for Russia, those kind of operations, that's kind of out of the question.
Well, let's turn the question around then and also think about it from NATO's perspective, because you talked about how Russia's going to need a line of communication to Kaliningrad in the event of any kind of conflict. But my understanding is also that if NATO wants to protect the Baltic states, that line of communication is the Suwalki Gap. So if the Russians were able to blitzkrieg in there via the Baltics and close some of that off and at least establish a position, maybe NATO could punch through eventually, but it would be very difficult. There would be a large There would be a large cost to NATO if that gap at one point got closed to try and reopen it. So is that a vulnerability, or was, when you said that there are NATO forward deployments, that you think those forward deployments make that kind of Russian move just unrealistic?
Look, I think those forward deployments would make a Russian advance very slow, which means that NATO would have a lot of time to actually fight back. And, keep in mind that pretty much anything within Kaliningrad is within artillery range of the countries around it. If not artillery range, we have a lot of cruise missiles, air-launched weapons, etc. Kaliningrad is a static target. It is just there until we decide it is not. And so I think from that perspective, if Russia starts to advance into Poland, into the Baltics, if we can just hold them back long enough to conduct all of the sorties to empty Kaliningrad, not entirely. I'm talking big talk here, but if we can erode that presence in Kaliningrad quite rapidly and sufficiently, Russia has nothing left to do there. And I think that's a potential scenario that Russia will very likely have in mind when it starts to consider things like that.
Yeah, it is just there until we decide it is not. That is the quote of the podcast so far. Let's talk a little bit more broadly about NATO as well, because big changes are afoot in NATO. It looks like Turkey has withdrawn its objections and that Sweden and Finland are now on the fast track to joining NATO. I was reading the Turkish press yesterday about this, and I thought it was very funny that multiple articles I read insisted that the Turks did not ask for anything for this concession. They got some security assurances, but otherwise Turkey did this graciously and out of a sense of magnanimity. The first thing I want to ask you is, I know that's not true. The lady doth protest too much. But what do you think Turkey got, first of all? What do you think about Finland and Sweden joining? And then maybe we'll circle back around to talk about Turkey itself, because in many ways, Turkey is maybe the most interesting power in all of this war, sort of coming out of what the second effects are of this war. But let's just first start with NATO and Sweden and Finland, what that means for NATO going forward, and what you think Turkey got from its little hissy fit that it threw, not letting Finland and Sweden in initially.
Well, we've actually seen some leaked documents of the actual agreement that was signed between the three countries. And of course, this is diplomatic language. It won't go into the nitty-gritty of what will practically be done between those countries. And there might be some unspoken agreements that are part of this as well. But the few things that already stand out in that agreement are the two major asks that Turkey had expressed before. And one of those, obviously, is related to Finnish and Swedish support for Kurdish organizations, the YPG and PKK, and affiliated organizations. Now, in that regard, the document stresses very heavily Sweden and Finland's counterterrorism legislation and efforts. It essentially acknowledges the PKK as a terrorist organization. I forgot the exact wording, but it even literally mentions the YPG and the position toward the YPG in some levels. So I think it has the document very clearly has Finland and Sweden kind of establish their position as, we are going to limit the ability for these Kurdish groups to operate within Finland and Sweden, and we won't be going out there to support them. Of course, that is going to offend some political factions within Finland and Sweden, where I think in both parliaments there are actually some Kurdish lawmakers that had, of course, been pushing the opposite until now. So that might create some upset there. But of course, this was a very big ask for Turkey, a very big win that they had to take home to be able to say, we allowed this, right? And the other issue is kind of related to the Kurdish question, is about arms trade between Sweden and Finland on the one hand and Turkey on the other hand. Now, what actually happened between those countries is that in 2019, following Turkish operations into Syria against the Kurdish YPG, Sweden and Finland have actually stopped exporting weaponry to Turkey. I'm not sure if this was declared as like an official sanction or embargo. I believe not, actually. But the government essentially stopped to give export licenses that allowed any of this trade with Turkey. And Turkey has also been bringing this up recently in the discussion about their NATO membership, saying, well, we can't be in an alliance with countries that don't want to conduct arms trade with us. And of course, for Turkey, it's about more than simply having access to those arms. It's also about demining one of those pressure points, or one of those levers that Finland and Sweden are using in the Kurdish case, and they've effectively done so. So in the document that was signed, Finland and Sweden very clearly commit to having no restrictions on arms trade to Turkey. Now, that being said, that's a lot of big talk. In a little document that was signed in Madrid. The reality is we'll see how far Finland and Sweden actually take this. When we're talking about counterterrorism legislation or legislation about allowing export licenses for arms and military equipment, these things can get very complex, and there can be a lot of ways where you can very openly say on a diplomatic platform, yes, we're not going to put any restrictions on arms exports, and we're not going to allow the PKK or other Kurdish terrorists to operate inside Sweden. But then a few weeks later, the narrative might be like, well, what they technically did wasn't against the Swedish law, so we can't actually legally operate against them. And the whole debate can start over then. But this document has already served its purpose.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just going to say that it served its purpose. The Turkish government gets to go home with this document and gets to say, we forced Finland and Sweden to back off from supporting the Kurds, and we forced them to give up their arms embargo. And now that they've given all that up, we're cool with them being in the alliance. And it's a win for them.
Well, first of all, I have always found the situation of groups like the Kurds, just from a theoretical perspective, fascinating. The Kurds in particular are very interesting because there's so many different groups and so many different geographies. But I mean, I've always been very interested in them in general, and small aspiring states like that in general. And I'd throw Catalonia and Scotland and a couple other things into that same sort of category of things. But I didn't have a sense that Finnish and Swedish support for Syrian Kurds was that important. Am I misreading that? Are the Syrian Kurds and the PKK actually getting significant amounts of arms from Sweden and Finland to the point that it was affecting Turkey's sense of security on the battlefield, or is this more of a dog and pony show for Turkey?
No, we're not talking about military support for the YPG and the PKK so much as we are talking about political support, the ability for these organizations to freely operate within Swedish and Finnish territory. And of course, keep in mind, this is something that happens across Europe. There are a lot of European countries that have sizable Kurdish communities that are politically active. So they are conducting YPG or PKK related affairs within Europe. The difference is, of course, all those other countries are already in NATO. Finland and Sweden are not yet and have to get that approval. So that's where they are on the chopping block.
Yeah, I wonder if Turkey will then use that to try and close down those avenues in other NATO countries. But we'll get to Turkey in a second. What does this mean for NATO now that Sweden and Finland have joined? Who else could be joining next? What are your feelings about the prospect for the NATO alliance? I know that it seemed to me that right before this war started, I sort of thought NATO was on life support. And it seems to me one of the only things that Vladimir Putin has accomplished is he has basically resurrected NATO and given it new life. So I wonder what you think, if all of this matters at all, if NATO is just going to go back to squabbling with itself after war exhaustion, or if you think something has fundamentally changed within NATO, whether because of Sweden and Finland joining or just because there's a new political unity within the bloc against Russia.
Putin has definitely helped NATO get over its identity crisis. That's a fact. Through actions in Ukraine since 2014, I think we've already seen that return of purpose of actual required ambitions for NATO, and that's helped a lot in trying to get the organization back on track. Now, what it means to get Finland and Sweden involved, it's kind of a double discussion, because on the one hand, when we're talking military technically, Finland and Sweden were just about as integrated into NATO as you can be without being a signatory to the alliance. Finland is teaching a lot of the courses for other NATO countries, for example, through the Partnership for Peace. So, like, we are actually we've had them in the alliance in some shape or form for a long time. The big difference, of course, is that some particular levels have excluded them until now, which is the permanent military command. That will now also include Sweden and Finland, which means that level of interoperability, the command and control levels in case of an actual conflict erupting, that will go a little smoother. And in a similar layer, of course, intelligence sharing within NATO. Countries have had to arrange that on a bilateral level with Finland and Sweden in the past, but now the NATO as an organization will, of course, be able to capture that Finnish and Swedish intelligence, which is, by the way, they both have very capable intelligence organizations that will definitely benefit NATO. And I'm hoping that these countries will, of course, also be able to benefit from the intelligence that exists within the other countries in NATO. So those are going to be some big changes. But on the whole, militarily, the balance in the Baltic doesn't really change. Sweden and Finland have always been there, and they've always been on the side of NATO. The bigger thing that changes, I think, is more of a symbolic thing, and that is when we look at Russia and its the ambitions that it had set forth, or the complaints that it was throwing out before they invaded Ukraine, is that they were complaining about NATO destabilizing Central Europe, about the relentless NATO expansion, and in that case, they were, of course, referring to a potential membership of Ukraine. That expansion is endangering Russia's security, and there was a whole debate about the indivisibility of security, where you can't improve your own security at the cost of another country. But Russia was saying, look, but you are all improving your own security at the cost of ours, because you're building this massive alliance that sits right on our border. So Russia was complaining about all of that, and they decided that the best way to tackle that was to invade Ukraine. And what's the result? Oh, of course, now NATO is even closer to your borders. And so, I think that part of the narrative has definitely blown up in Russia's face. And I think that's kind of, it's a good counter to that whole Russian narrative, to Russia's efforts to use force to try and achieve certain objectives.
Yeah. Before I let you go, let's talk about Turkey head on for a second, because it seems to me that Turkey is the biggest winner in the Russia-Ukraine war from a long-term perspective. Russia is one of its key rivals historically. If Russia is going to be weaker or capacity constrained in general, all of that's good for Turkey. But Turkey itself has been much more pragmatic. It seems to be positioning itself as a mediator between Ukraine and Russia. Erdogan has been very careful not to shove it in Putin's face. I mean, they've done certain things that I'm sure piss Moscow off, but I would say that Turkey has been fairly meek compared to what their capacities and capabilities are to make life difficult for Russia in the context of a military conflict. So what do you think about Turkey's position in terms of Russia in the war right now, in terms of Turkey's position going forward, and especially Turkey's role in NATO in the long term? One of the things I thought before the war was that I thought Turkey was maybe the real break point in NATO, because it seemed like Turkey was going in a different direction than most of the other NATO members. I mean, just a year or two before the war, you had the French Navy and the Turkish Navy locking onto each other in the Mediterranean over a squabble about Libya. So, I mean, where do you sort of think in terms of Turkey's relationship to the war itself, and what Turkey's long-term strategic outlook looks like?
So Turkey, I'm sorry. Those are a lot of questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Just that was too much questions. Just pick the one that's most interesting and answer it.
Let me start with that Turkish and Russian dynamic, because, of course, on some level, Turkey and Russia are very staunch competitors, but on another level, they also will collaborate. And we see Russia selling the S-400 systems to Turkey, which, of course, in itself became one of the big rifts between Turkey and other NATO countries. So, at some levels, it's like, is Turkey actually pro-Russian, or is Turkey anti-Russian? And it's a very crafty country. I think in terms of its international policy, Russia has had a very, very crafty approach to that. And you mentioned the Turkish role in negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, and to be able to mediate negotiations in that way, you have to instill some level of trust in the different countries that are engaged in those negotiations. Now, being able to instill that trust, especially with Russia, given all of the different theaters where Turkey is in direct competition with Russia, and at the same time, providing the famous Bayraktar drones to Ukraine and being a member of NATO, that's quite a power play. How they pull it off, I'm not so sure. But I think that they are just very, very good at what they are doing in terms of playing out those international relations. Now, on the other level, when we're talking about the relations between Turkey and the West, primarily NATO, but we've also had a strong dynamic between Turkey and the EU as an institution. Mm-hmm. And I think both of those kind of run on the same level. I think that the problem there is that, Turkey has basically outgrown its initial position in which it engaged with those countries. Turkey has been growing into a country that has broader regional ambitions. Of course, the economic developments inside Turkey are probably going to provide some constraint to that. I think 10 years back, we were expecting a lot more out of Turkey in terms of developing its regional power base. Now, of course, with massive inflation inside Turkey, the question is, will that financial element ever catch up with their ability to project power? But either way, the Turkish government and the Turkish people, I think, are still considering Turkey a great power, a power that can actually start to play a significant role on the world theater and start to throw its weight around. And I think that's exactly what we see with NATO, with Europe. They're not just taking it. They are going to want to make sure that they are listened to. If someone wants to achieve something, they're going to have to get something in return that helps them further along on their path. And we've seen that in the way that Turkey deals with migration issues when it's dealing with the European Union. We've seen that how Turkey deals with NATO, not just about Finland and Sweden joining, but in the past, we've seen Turkey throw out similar objections to NATO programs with Austria, for example. Of course, this is not new to NATO. We should also understand that NATO is not some kind of supranational level that controls these countries, and they're all supposed to be aligned and part of one big whole. And throughout NATO's history, we've had a lot of conflicts within, not armed conflicts, of course, but we've had a lot of political conflicts between NATO partners. Everybody remembers France at one point stepping outside of the NATO command. They were still a signatory of the treaty. They were still part of NATO, but they abandoned the permanent military command, which, of course, was a sign of a big breach of trust between France and other countries in NATO. And I think we can see Turkey in a similar position now. France itself, of course, being one of the greater powers within NATO as well. And I think Turkey is growing into that kind of a role, whether it is based on perception or on actual capacity. The future will tell. I'm no expert on the Turkish economy and how they will actually be able to rectify that or continue to project power in the future. But I think that is the big clash. It's Turkish ambitions are outgrowing some of the relations that had been established prior to their newfound position.
I know you just tried to poo-poo your own expertise, but I think you're more of an expert than you think. And I was going to ask at the end of that, if you think Turkey is going to be a great power 10 years from now. So in 2032, do you think we're talking about Turkey as a great power, or is it still this kind of middle power that is balancing between different forces and trying to gain prestige for being a mediator, or you have to do X, Y, and Z before we agree to something? Do you have a position on that, or are you going to punt?
I honestly have no idea. I think it would take a lot to rise Turkey to that level where it truly becomes uncontested and establish its regional hegemony, so to speak. I think Turkey's already shown that it can bite off a lot. We see it operating in Libya, in Azerbaijan, Armenia. We see it operating in Iraq, Syria. So obviously it is able to chew off some huge chunks and keep that going. But I think, realistically, with all the other powers that are positioned around Turkey and that are operating in those very same theaters, I think that kind of bartering and compromising is going to remain a part of that.
Gotcha. Before I let you go, Sim, because I know you have a squash match that you have to probably stretch for, because as we're getting older, I find that I have to stretch in order to do things. What didn't I ask you that you'd like to make sure the listeners know?
So there is one thing that I actually wanted to talk about that I forgot to mention earlier when we were talking about the developments on the battlefield in Ukraine. But there has been something interesting going on, and that is that over the past 3 weeks or so, we've seen Ukraine conduct a sustained campaign of deep strikes behind the Russian front lines and even into Russia itself. And this is quite notable because in the beginning of the conflict, we had seen Ukraine conduct occasional attacks of this sort, primarily using the Tochka ballistic missiles that it has. But now we are seeing quite a few of these, and just in recent weeks, we've had attacks on several command posts that are located, easily 50 to 100 kilometers behind Russian lines. We had an attempted attack against the Kursk air base just a few days ago, and Ukraine is using kind of a varied arsenal of remaining Tochka missiles. I'm not sure how deep the stocks of those kind of missiles in Ukraine still run, but they still seem to have some to actually launch. They're using kamikaze drones, so drones essentially outfitted as cruise missiles, and then some old targeting drones, so target drones that are used to train your air defense systems on, but now they are filling those with explosives and essentially using this as cruise missiles as well, but they have quite a bit of range. So this actually works out really well. That's what they used in the attack against the Kursk air base. And then, of course, the U.S. Provided HIMARS system, which has a range of up to about 70 kilometers. We've seen a few strikes already that really look like it's that system being put to good use, and the U.S. has just promised more of these systems as well. So the ability to conduct those deep strikes, I think it's something new for Ukraine. The question is, will they be able to sustain this tempo over time? But I think if they can, that this starts to impose some very, very significant constraints on Russian military operations, especially when it comes to command and control, when it comes to logistics. It makes it really hard for Russia to establish those static depots and command posts that can help it, get some organization into the battlefield. So if Ukraine is constantly able to hunt those down and to effectively strike those, you essentially deny Russia that level of organization on the battlefield. And that can be very powerful. And at the same time, we've actually seen Russia having to scale back those kind of strikes. In the beginning of the conflict, I'm sure you remember very well, we had daily reports of cruise missiles striking different towns throughout Ukraine, all the way west to Lviv. So there were a lot of these deep strikes using the Caliber cruise missiles and other weapon systems. Russia also using the Tochka systems, the Iskander missiles, of course, and that has kind of died down. And then my understanding is that this is because of the level of the stockpiles that these weapons have reached in Russia. So it's trying to ration those weapons, not to use all of them at the same time, trying to mix in some of those older but very inaccurate weapons. But most of all, just conducting less of these attacks. And I wonder even whether the Kremenchuk attack that occurred last week that hit the shopping mall, whether that was kind of an attempt by Russia at a retaliation against these Ukrainian deep strikes, because they don't really seem to have a big answer to them. So maybe they were like, oh, if you're going to strike against Russia, we're going to strike behind your front lines again. And then, of course, they botched it at majestic proportions. But that's kind of an interesting dynamic. A lot of people are rightfully focusing on the ground forces clashing on the front line, but there's a strategic level of warfare that is playing out behind us, and that takes shape in these longer range missile strikes. And I think we're seeing some positive developments on the part of Ukraine there.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Number one, because it's nice to have a little bit of good news on this podcast. I feel like it's been all doom and gloom for the past couple of months. But also because, a lot of our listeners are, about half are in the United States, but most are in Western countries in general. And I do think there is a gap opening up between what the West thinks is happening and what Ukraine thinks is happening and what Eastern Europeans think is happening. Because, we had Jacek on just last week, and I thought one of the starkest things about that podcast was he was saying from a Polish perspective, now's the time. Let's hammer Russia. Let's go after them. Let's go on the offensive. Ukraine is saying the same thing. Whereas Macron and Scholz and all these, they're not saying that. They're not quite in weenie land, but they're approaching the sort of, no, we need to dial this down. We need to de-escalate.
But I think you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned energy prices earlier.
Yep. And then that all gets back to whether the United States can export the amount of LNG that it's promising to the Europeans. And there's some doubts about that too, but we could talk about that for another hour. Sim, thank you so much for coming on. Tell the listeners before you go where you are right now and where they can follow more of your work if they're interested.
You can always track me on Twitter at SimTack. That's about it. That's about where I put all my stuff. Sorry.
That's great. He drinks and he knows things. Sim, have a great day, and we'll have you back in a couple months and check back in, okay?
All right. Thank you very much. Great to be here.
All right. Cheers. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.